Hi, guys. It's Christina Alley, licensed mental health counselor, and I'm here to speak to you today about boundaries. So, one of the things I often get asked about as a counselor is about boundaries, especially with it being such a hot topic. I want you to understand that the purpose of a boundary is not to push somebody away, it can be when needed. However, a boundary is something that we should be using to foster connection, not to hinder it. A boundary is a way that you communicate what you need in a relationship and also how you can respect what other people need in a relationship. Again, this isn't to just say, no, that's my boundary. It's to say, well, no, this is like how I feel safe or how I feel safest. Boundaries are a way to make relationships last, they make relationships doable. If we don't have boundaries, we're going to be expelling too much energy or taking on too much from other people. And so boundaries really keep us safe. They keep our energy safe, but they also keep the other people safe. So as we learn to set boundaries within ourselves and we learn to respect our needs and communicate those needs with respect, we're also allowing that other person to speak their need and we're respecting what they need. It really fosters healthy relationships. So we want to make sure that we're setting a boundary, but we're doing that and communicating that with a loving posture and an assumption that that person does not know how much that impacted us. Boundaries are a way that we train other people to understand our needs a little bit better. There are a bunch of different ways to categorize boundaries. There are a bunch of different authors that have different ways to communicate boundary styles. However, for our purposes of today's video, we are only going through three basic boundary styles. We'll go through some of those loose corrections for each. I also will have a link in the description box in the D box for the handout from therapistaid.com, which also condenses the three different types of boundary styles. So hopefully in conjunction with this video, you can use that handout and it will be helpful for you. So the first boundary style that we're going to go through is called porous boundaries. And porous boundaries are when we let too much good in and too much good out. So we can be over focused on other people's life. We can tend to be over involved, giving too much of ourselves. And at first, the intention might be really great. It might be very heartwarming for you to want to give so much. However, over time, giving that much really takes a toll, not only on you, but it can also take a toll on your loved ones. If they're experiencing like mom being gone all the time or dad being gone all the time, if you're constantly volunteering for things. So we can really start to see that like our relationships get very impacted by us giving too much, and we get impacted by giving too much. So we see a high rate of codependence when it comes to those who have porous boundaries. Sometimes trauma survivors end up developing porous boundaries because, of course, we are unsure of our needs being okay or our ability to say no. As a matter of fact, some of the trauma survivors that I work with would even say that they feel guilty setting boundaries, like they shouldn't say no. So, in some way, shape, or form, this porous boundary is our inability to say yes and no at the right times. And our energy might feel a little bit chaotic. Our life just overall may feel like it lacks definition. So some of that might just feel like, oh my goodness, I'm being tossed in the wind all the time and I'm just so busy. It's crazy. So that's probably at times an indicator of porous boundaries. And again, this isn't about being a good person or a bad person or anything like that. Each boundary style is going to have some pros and it's going to have some cons. I say this is a very, very good, big heart gone wrong. And it just needs some limits and some ability to protect itself in some way. And then also remember, if we can respect our own boundaries, we are more likely to respect the boundaries of others. So that is porous boundaries. If you think about it, there's too much coming in and too much going out. It's just a lot going on. So keep that in mind. The second type of boundary that we're going to go through is what we call rigid boundaries. And much like the name sounds, you can probably imagine that rigid boundaries don't let much in and they don't let much out. So when we start looking at rigid boundaries, there's really not this ability to connect in a way that feels healthy. Really, a lot of times I see maybe an avoidant attachment with this, which we'll go through attachment in a later video. But having said that, a lot of times they have a hard time with connection. I am an island. I can take care of myself. That feels good to take care of myself. And again, this can be in response to trauma. It doesn't have to be, but it can be in that we've been hurt in some way. We hurt in relationships, and in many ways, we heal in relationships. But if we're still hurting, then we don't want to be in a relationship. We can trust the party of one, uno. And a lot of times that doesn't mean you want to be in a relationship, and nor do you trust relationships. And in many ways, as a counselor, of course, I understand and have compassion on those who have difficulty connecting because it doesn't feel safe. In this situation, some people might be seen as aggressive. Some people may be seen as too demanding or unwilling to share about themselves. We all have an attachment system that needs connection. However, this group will likely struggle with letting people in. It will feel very awkward. And so we may or may not see a healthy connection with somebody that has rigid boundaries. If somebody that has really rigid boundaries might be paired with somebody who has very porous boundaries, because the person who has the porous boundaries is catering to the person who has the rigid boundaries. It's just one of those things. But going back to kind of the rigid boundary, we want to make sure that you are, as we're thinking about this, again, it's not good or bad. It's just a way that you've learned to relate to people. It's a way that you've learned to interact with the world. So that is a quick summary of rigid boundaries. If you want to think about this in terms of a picture, we would be in Fort Knox, just you surrounded by a whole circle of things that aren't letting anything in, and you're really not letting anything out. You don't want to give too much of yourself. Absolutely not. And you definitely don't want a lot of help from other people. You're good. With that, again, in the description box, there is that handout from therapistaid.com, and they have a great illustration in that they use. And hopefully I'll be able to put some graphics in the video. Be sure to check out the description box for any resources and links there. Okay, and the last boundary style that I want to go through with you is, of course, healthy boundaries. The joyful noise of healthy boundaries. So, with healthy boundaries, we're able to let some in, not everything, some good in, and some of our goodness out. So that doesn't mean we're volunteering for everything, but we might volunteer for something that's really meaningful for us. We don't want to overpack our calendar, but we do want to have some time for interaction with others and time for interaction with self. And again, this type of boundary style, healthy boundary styles, there is so much freedom in this because I am okay by myself and I'm okay and I feel safe in relationships. Now, if we've gone through trauma, sometimes boundary styles can be, of course, impacted, making us either rigid or porous. I understand that. Of course, we understand that. However, I want you to hear that we can develop healthy boundaries when we have safe people to practice with. I've heard it said before in a group setting. I was facilitating group counseling. We were going through boundaries, and somebody said, one time I heard from my therapist, and it was a different therapist, that they said sometimes setting boundaries is going to grind the gears. So just understand that as you are aiming for healthy boundaries, you might kind of tilt into rigid if you're trying to correct porous. And if you're rigid, you might kind of, tip over into some of the porous boundaries. But just kind of keep that in mind as we're practicing developing healthy boundaries, letting some out and letting some in, but not all out or all in. We want to make sure that you're understanding that we can learn that, but we might grind the gears like learning stick shift at first, if that makes sense. Maybe that's not a good analogy. I don't know. Okay, so let's go through some of the corrections of these boundary styles. And really, I guess if we're healthy, that's where ideally we want to be. So the corrections that we want to talk about is either too porous or too rigid. So let's talk about those corrections. Some of the challenges I want to give you who have identified your boundary style as porous. Of course, you are in good company. There's plenty of wonderful people that have porous boundaries, but that does mean that we want to make some corrections. And corrections may include learning how to say no more often, really identifying and challenging the guilt that you might have with saying no or setting a boundary, making sure that you're working with either like a counselor or a friend or a life coach, something that can kind of help walk you through that. Listen to yourself. Why is it difficult for you to say no? Maybe that's something that you want to journal about. What makes it difficult to set a boundary? And what makes it difficult to hear the boundary? Because, of course, again, if we can set boundaries, then we can hear boundaries. But if we have a hard time setting boundaries, we might feel rejected when somebody gives us a boundary. So, really kind of doing some self searching there. And if you identify with a porous boundary, like I said, you're a part of a safe community here. And if you want to share any of your experience with that, feel free to do that in the comments below and kind of share your experience, or maybe you have some additional insights or thoughts about your experience with porous boundaries. And that can be a valuable resource for any of us to learn from. Everybody has a unique experience, and your voice, your experience with porous boundaries, it doesn't mean that you're good or bad. Again, it's just the way that you've learned to give or receive love and how to set boundaries. It has probably never been taught, or it was taught in a way that was hard or painful. And so it wasn't a healthy lesson. So those are some of the corrections that I would say with porous: really learning how to say no, to collect your energy, spending time alone, and maybe even just journaling, talking with a friend about what makes it difficult, because there may be some more bigger things underneath your inability to say no, or your inability to set a boundary or hear a boundary. So be compassionate with yourself, be curious with yourself, and of course, we can help move you in to healthy boundary setting. Okay, so our last bit of boundary corrections are going to be for our rigid folks. Again, this is just a way that you've learned to interact with the world. So, in making these corrections, we want to practice saying more yeses. Maybe more yeses to sharing about how your day was, or more yeses on a hangout, or more yeses for helping somebody with something. Porous boundaries, we get over involved, but of course, rigid boundaries, we just, you deal with you, boo, and I'll deal with me. So maybe not over involving ourselves with things, but maybe offering our opinion a little bit more often, or offering our time or resource with somebody, a group of people, and maybe even volunteering time or offering to help a friend move or something. And it also is important to understand, as you're correcting rigid boundaries, I'm not asking you to do that with everybody. I want you to practice with a couple really safe people, because the last thing that I would want to happen to you is that you practice being a bit more healthy and flexible in your boundary style, and somebody either taking advantage of that or shirking it off and not really like taking you seriously. Be selective in who you practice with, whether you're porous or you're rigid. But this really is, for my rigid folks, just a call to soften up a bit in the connections, just because over time, rigid boundaries can really lead to a sense of isolation. Your corrections become, of course, just giving a little bit more of yourself, being compassionate with yourself, understanding that there are going to be missed opportunities. It might even be frustrating or tiring at first. Again, we'd love to hear from our rigid folks in the comments if you've experienced either a rigid boundary style, or maybe you have a rigid boundary style, what that's been like for you, or if there's any valuable insights that you want to share in terms of your experience with that. We'd love to hear it. All of us can learn. That's why we're here. That's why we're curious about our boundary styles. We're curious about other people's boundary styles. So be gentle and curious with yourself. And if you feel safe, if that feels good, if you want to share part of what that's been like for you to have a rigid boundary style or to experience it, we'd love to hear it. Of course, for my healthy boundary folks, kudos to you. I'm glad that you have found your balance and your stride and energy in and energy out. We love that. I love that for you. We won't need to make any corrections there, but you can also share maybe some of the things that help you, maybe setting boundaries. And if you were rigid or if you were porous, one of the two extremes, and you somehow got yourself to a healthy place, How did that happen? And what corrections did you make that really helped along the way? Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for giving me so much of your time today. Thank you for being curious about yourself and others and your willingness to really invest in healthy relationships. I hope that you will like this video. It really does help our channel as we're starting to grow. If you can subscribe, even better, notifications, cherry on top. And we would love to see you on any of the other platforms that we're on, including Instagram, TikTok, and our podcast on any major podcasting platform called The Art of Flourishing. Gorgeous name, right? So creative. But anyways, so thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoy practicing your corrections for either rigid or porous boundaries. And if you are in healthy boundaries, continue to enjoy your relationships. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time. Happy healing!